I've been traumatized by depersonalization.
This is another major concern that I hear from people all the time. They worry that their experience with DPDR has been so profoundly terrifying that they've been traumatized by it. This, they believe, will greatly overcomplicate the recovery process and maybe even make it impossible to recover at all. So let's take a look at this. Firstly, what is trauma? Trauma is a word that we use to describe an emotional response to a terrible event, like say a natural disaster or a traffic accident, or what we perceive to have been a terrible event, even though we weren't actually in any danger, like say a panic attack or a bad drug experience. Where people get confused is that they think that feeling traumatized is an imaginary line that has been permanently crossed. They think that there are two main groups here: DPDR sufferers and DPDR sufferers who've been traumatized by their experience, and the latter may never be able to recover. But again, it's drawing this imaginary line in the sand between people who supposedly can and can't recover, and worrying that you've somehow crossed that line because, in this instance, you feel like you've been traumatized. But it simply doesn't make sense. Because again, what is trauma? It's not a line in the sand. It's a word we use to describe an emotional and psychological response. And it's perfectly natural to have an emotional and psychological response to something that's as intensely frightening as the sudden onset of DPDR. In my case, I thought that overnight I had damaged my brain with drugs. I lost my income, I had to move home with my parents, I couldn't enjoy films, books, or music anymore. At one point, months into my experience, I remember lying on the floor and just crying, grieving for the life that I used to have. Was it a traumatic experience? You better believe it was. But did the fact that it was traumatic mean that I couldn't recover? Of course not. Again, it's an emotional and psychological response. It would be weird if you and I didn't have an emotional and psychological response to something as frightening as that. And especially at the start when you've only just developed it and you have no idea why you're experiencing all these strange and terrifying symptoms. But again, at no point does having that response push you across some imaginary line that you can't come back from. And okay, let's assume for a minute that you have been traumatized. How do we deal with traumatic memories? The way to resolve traumatic memories is to process them. With regard to DPDR, how do we do that? We do that by understanding what the condition is, understanding that we don't need to be afraid of it, and why each one of its symptoms, as frightening as they may have been, are part of our body and brain's natural and correct defense mechanism. Again, no permanent line has been crossed, and you can and will recover.